Welcome to season 3.
Hi.
Hey, look at you.
Good, good. So we're going to test the light quickly. So
Okay.
this one, and
No.
this one.
Do the first one again. Oh, it's tough. I think the first one.
This one.
Yeah, but there's not a lot of color on your face. Go with
This one.
it's a little red. I don't know. It's hard to tell.
I look a little tan.
We'll go with that.
We'll go with that. I never look tan. So
It'll be like you came back from Tahiti or something.
that's right. Exactly.
Hello and welcome to Change for the Better, The Power of Arts in Education, episode 32. I'm Stacy Tiro, a high school performing arts teacher for over 25 years. I've taught a lot of amazing people. Now that so many of my students are adults, they'll teach me how, through the lessons in my classroom, they have been changed for the better. I am talking to somebody who was one of my students from very early on in my career, kind of almost back to the time of Robin Carujo, couple years after that. In the first year that I started to actually teach dance in the high school, she was in my first dance class at Spring Valley High School. That's how far back she goes. She, of course, went on to perform in Thespians. She got like bit by the performing bug. She was in my first fall drama called The Worst High School Play in the World. And I love telling that to my students now because they're like, wait, it was the worst. I was like, no, but it was the best. It was so good.
That's
So at the time, she was a sophomore. And she hilariously played a queen of some sort who wore a crown which was a car hubcap. So like that's how silly and crazy it was. And I think we held on to that hubcap in the prop room for many, many, many years. So she also like learned lights and did crew, and she loved singing and dancing and the musicals on stage for her last couple of years. And in our little thespian world now, she has become somewhat of a legend. So I can't tell the story in full because it's the sacred stuff that my current students would not want me to reveal. It's very, secret tradition kind of stuff, but it involves this person and has become a beloved tradition of each new company that mounts a new show. And her generosity, let's just say, at the end of high school has become a source of strength and good fortune for over 20 years worth of theater students. And after telling the story to the kids, it tickles me to share with them that this person is real and she was sitting where they once sat and had given something special of herself to many generations after she was out of high school. So after she graduated in 1999, she went to UC Berkeley. She studied history. And then she hopped the pond to get her master's at the London School of Economics. And then for the past 15 years, she has worked as a marketing executive and is now let me just make sure I have this right, a strategic marketing leader for JP Morgan. Pretty big stuff. And I believe she bears a VP title in there somehow. Yeah, so big dealing. She is and always has been brilliant, quick-witted, and kind. And I am so honored to have this busy working mom take the time away from her two young girls who hopefully are napping or out with dad to chat with me today. So now we're just going to move to the next part of the interview, which is question number 1, because we have 10 questions. And this is, what is your name, the year that you graduated, and tell me a little bit more about what you do now.
So I'm Dara Handelman. At the time that I was in school, it was Dara Orlando. I graduated in 1999, which is still crazy to think about.
I know.
And so I work in marketing. So right now I work in product marketing, specifically in the payments division at JP Morgan. But I've been working in advertising and marketing since I graduated from my master's program in 2004.
Wow. Did you get a little English accent when you were over there?
No, but because I lived in California and then I lived in London right afterwards, when I came back, my sister used to make fun of me that I kind of had no accent whatsoever. It just kind of shifted back and forth, you know. I can not so much anymore, but right when I came back, I could fake a pretty good British accent.
I'm pretty sure it could come back to you if you need it, if you had
if I was there for a little while, I think it would come back pretty good.
Yeah. So here's how this thing works. I have another 9 questions to throw out at you, and it all reflects on your experience back in high school and basically how did it impact your transition into your adulthood. Using your adult brain, describe your adolescent self.
I think she was more self-assured than she realized in some aspects, and then in other aspects was just wildly self-conscious and probably more than she needed to be. At the same time, I think she was very clear on who she was, which has been a thread kind of throughout. And looking back, I'm very proud of that. Like, I don't know that every teenager knows like who they are and what they want to do and what they're interested in. And so I think there was a lot of that that I had back then, but it was just covered in a shroud of self-consciousness, which I'm sure that's very common in teenagers, but looking back, it feels like kind of like wasted effort.
Yeah, that's a very, very much a running theme on this podcast. Everybody kind of looks back, and not everybody feels like they were connected to who they were at the time, but they all said, man, I spent a lot of time worrying about way too much stuff. So there was the, I don't know, sort of chaotic brain work of the teenage self. At the time, we didn't have the dance studio back then. That didn't come till several years later, but we danced in one half of the gym with the wall closed and basketball
Yes, that's right.
like playing on the other side.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, guys, let's do a plie.
You could hear them playing whatever they were playing in gym. That's so funny.
I'm so blessed right now because we actually have a dance studio. I close the door and like we're all done.
That's
we
so nice.
It's really great. So we rehearsed like for Thespians. We were kind of all over the place. Sometimes it was on the stage, sometimes it was in the music room. It was like wherever we can find the space. When you were in the dance class, in the gym, or in the rehearsal space, or on stage performing, what was something or some things that happened there that kind of helped you to manage or to regulate your adolescent self?
I think a lot of it was the community. High school can be overwhelming in that, you know, there's so much going on, friendships and like all that nonsense, right? There's always some sort of drama or something happening. And I felt like there was a lot of constancy in the community. For me, it was Thespians for most of my time. Their dance came later. It was just really nice to have the people. And I think that's what always grounded me. It always felt like you had support. And there was always somebody who would listen. There were a lot of times when it was very hard for me to get out of my own head. I have very specific memories of sitting in that music room during like a rehearsal or something that was going on. And somebody from Thespians was like, we were talking, you know, like that to me was the thing that grounded me throughout high school. I think without that, I'm sure maybe I would have found it somewhere else, but for me, that became my community. And it was what kept me sane probably the most throughout everything. But I think it was also, it was a different group of people I wouldn't have classes with, sometimes just because like they were a senior and you were a sophomore. And sometimes it was because you just had wildly different schedules, a different group of people than I maybe saw every day during the day. And that also made it really nice. It was like not always the same cast of characters that I saw in class. It was just really refreshing, I think. And when I think about like being on stage or being in practice in a really positive way, I think you pushed me quite a bit. Like I I didn't realize until I was in college, and really not even until my senior year, that I was actually funny.
Seriously?
Seriously, I'm dead serious. I had no idea. And I can tell you that story in a second when I realized it.
Okay.
But you pushed me into those roles, right? And I think if I hadn't been surrounded by people that I loved and trusted, I don't think I could have done it.
Wow. That's amazing, because from early on, and I remember from like that first play, that worst high school play, that part, Queen, whatever it was,
Yeah.
and it must have been an audition. I don't have a clear memory of that, but I do remember the feeling of saying, "Oh my God, this kid is funny. Yeah, she needs to be there. She's got the wit, she's got the quick, the timing. She's got that." Wow.
Oh, so funny. So I didn't realize it until my senior year of college.
All right, tell me that story.
So when I was in my sorority, your freshman year, one of the things you do during initiation week is everybody sits in a circle and you write something about the person sitting next to you, and that paper sort of goes through the circle, and then you don't look at it again until you graduate. So I never saw what was on that sheet of paper until my senior year. And then we all sat down together, we opened it up, and literally like all 30 people, every single person in my pledge class wrote that I was one of the funniest people they had ever met. And I was like, really? I had no idea.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Isn't it not, like, why did it have to take 4 years for you to like?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that was the other thing, right? Like, I think I took the actual plays themselves quite seriously. So even though I mostly featured in the comedies, right? Like that was where I had my bigger roles.
Mm-hmm.
It never occurred to me that that's why you put me there. You know what I mean?
There was a reason for it.
Yeah, but it never, I was like 16. I guess I didn't process it that way.
Well, when you're 16, you often have a very narrow vision of who you are and what you're capable of. And I'm constantly trying to tell kids, like, you're more than what you think. Like, just keep reaching out and keep trying these new things. And so, yeah, I wind up shoving kids out of the box. Like, no, you got more than that. Come on, keep going.
But I do think like there's an element of that that's really nice. When I think back to, because I was, what's her name, Cookie in Rumors.
Oh my God, yeah.
And there's that scene where you're like crawling on the floor or whatever. And I had that awful brown dress. Remember that awful brown and tan dress?
I do.
And everybody else is in like this beautiful gown and they look gorgeous. And I look like a crazy 70-year-old woman. And all I remember thinking at the time was like, why do I have to look like the crazy 70-year-old woman? Like that's my memory of that. In actuality, it was a great role. And I'm so glad I got to play it. Sure. And it took me a while to get over that, right? Like I remember feeling like everybody looks so sleek and stylish. And when in prepping for this, I was looking at some old pictures and I saw the pictures of like Aloys and Beth and Amy, and they all look beautiful. And I look kind of crazy. So, and I just remember that feeling. But now looking back on it, I'm like, that was totally my part. I totally see what you saw now in hindsight. But when you're like 16 or 17, you don't see that.
No, I saw that picture because I was sort of doing some prep for this. I was like, oh, that's right. That's right. She played like the crazy person.
The crazy person. Totally. Totally. Yeah.
Oh, but you did it well. You did it well. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Like, as you reflect back to that time, and, we learn a lot of things about ourselves, and sometimes we don't really think about it until way later on. What are some of the lessons that you learned back then that you actually still think about or use today?
It's funny because I don't think a lot of it was very concrete. One of the things that I think you learn when you're in theater, and you learn it a little bit in dance, but it can be a little different, but definitely in theater, is that it's never just you. By and large, you cannot pull off a production like that entirely on your own. That is a really important lesson, especially for somebody like me who was not into athletics. So like that element of teamwork was just, I was a cheerleader, but that was it, right? Like I didn't have that. So I learned that in theater. I was dancing since I was little. I didn't necessarily even learn that in dance, although you do have that a little bit in some of the bigger productions, but I learned that in theater. It's not just you, it's everybody. And I think as I've become like a manager of people, as I've sort of grown in my career, one of the things that I think I enjoy the most is building that community, because it's Like you want to be around people who you like being around. You want to be able to help people and to work together. And I think that's a big lesson that I picked up there, specifically working in Thespians with you guys. Like I don't know that I would have learned that. I mean, maybe I would have picked it up later, but I don't know that I would have learned that elsewhere. That was a big one for me. I think the other thing is that, and this one probably took me a while to really take in, but like everyone has something that they're strong at or good at, to the point I just made, right? Like you always put me in the comedies, and there's a reason for that. That doesn't mean I couldn't do a drama, but I was better at that. It's okay to be strong at something and to be good at other stuff, but to have the one or two things or handful of things that you're best at. And I think that's a hard lesson to learn when you're like an overachiever. You know, you want to be good at every subject. You want to be good at every activity. You have to have like every rope at graduation. It's different to think that, you know what, like I can be good at this. And also, and this I actually learned more in dance, is you can be good at something and not great at something. And that's okay. That was a very bitter pill to swallow, having danced since I was a little kid. Um, you know, I always wanted to be like Misty Copeland, and I'm definitely not Misty Copeland on the dance floor. And when you realize it, it's like, okay, that's okay. You know, like I could never do that. My body just can't do what she does, right? And that's okay. I think those are the realizations and the lessons that I learned. I just don't think they hit me really in practice until a little later.
You know, you spoke about the concept of community and how community supported you in the things that, maybe were less comfortable for you then, but you were really good at. Those were strengths. And I was looking at your LinkedIn profile because I always like to try and do a little research before I come to these podcasts. One of the things that you talk about is the idea of cultivating the relationships with the people that work for you or that you work with. My husband works in corporate too. And you don't always have leadership who value the community aspect of business. Whether you're doing a theater play, you're doing, marketing or whatever corporate stuff that you're doing, it's really all about people. In order to get jobs done, whatever tasks they are, it's all about the people who are working it. So if you can foster those kind of positive, caring relationships, even in a business professional environment, that's just going to make the experience of doing that business so much better. You're going to retain your people for so much longer.
And you build relationships, right? Like I always joke with my husband that 50% or more of the people who came to my wedding were people that I worked with at one point in time. Those are my closest friends. You spend so much time with these people, you want to enjoy them. I think some of that is you have to build it yourself. Some of it happens naturally. But I also think that for me, it became a life source in the same way that theater for me was a life source in high school. I think the community around me at work became a similar kind of life source. It's very similar. There's a lot of stress in school. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's people drama. It's school drama. It's you failed a test. It's you're applying for colleges. It's whatever. And you need people to keep you sane. And I think it's the same thing. Like working in advertising, I was working 80, 90, 100-hour weeks. And if I didn't like the people around me, I can guarantee you I would be a very different person. And like you need that. And some of that I had to build myself. And, like you figure it out, right? How to create the environments that you want to be in. And to your point, sometimes I did it without support from above. And there were a lot of times when like I was buying snacks out of my own budget and, buying bottles of wine and bringing them to the office and keeping everybody happy. But it's also what I wanted. So I think you're right. Those lessons track. Ultimately, the message is it's just people. You forget that like even behind a big brand, it's just more people.
Right. It's more people and higher stakes too.
Right.
So if you can't like go about your business and enjoy, look, life is not a party per se, but whatever you're doing, you want to be able to get some joy out of it.
Totally.
Otherwise, work just is this drag along thing that you're doing to get a paycheck. And then what are you doing? What's it all for?
And I think that's the other thing, right? Like there were painful times when you're practicing for a play and it's just like, oh, it's just grueling, or you're waiting around or whatever it is. It's the same thing at work, right? Like I work in advertising and marketing, seemingly creative field. There's a lot of boring stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis.
Of course.
And you have to be prepped for that. It sounds very exciting. I have had a lot of people who work in finance come to me and they're like, oh, you work in marketing. It's so fun. I'm like, it's fun like 25% of the time. But the other 75% of the time I can manage it now because, I know how to do it and I know how to regulate myself. And I think some of that you learn at a young age.
This kind of goes right into my next question. So going along this line, how do you think that you've changed since graduating from high school?
I've grown into myself, is what I'll say. I realized probably after college, but while I was in college, I think I kind of started to figure out a little bit more like who I am, what I want to be, what I want to do, what that looks like. I had a sense of it in high school. But I think what ended up happening over time is I built up a well of confidence that surrounded that I think I just lacked. And I think that's been what pushed me forward. It's fine and dandy to know what you want to do, but if you can't get yourself there, then it doesn't really quite matter.
Right.
And there are a lot of things that I didn't realize. Like, I think it just kind of happened. I'm sure there's like things you could do to practice building these things. Like, I didn't do it. I just remember at my first job, I worked in like large scale event planning, and my boss, I had been working for like 2 months, and my boss got to go to Sundance for an event, and our client was sponsoring an event at South by Southwest, and I just walked up to him and I was like, I'm doing the event at South by. And he was like, okay. I had like no experience, but I just knew that I could do it, and I just did it. I think I just had a sense of myself that I probably wasn't even super aware of.
Yeah.
But it was building, looking back now, it was building over time. I can't imagine there are a ton of like 17-year-olds who could do something like that. So I do think that that comes with age a little bit.
Do you think that like getting pushed out of your comfort zone back then kind of helped to sort of jumpstart that process?
I think so. I think there was always a part of me that wanted to do something different. Like even just going to Berkeley. I remember, and I'm not going to say I didn't get homesick. I remember the first 3 weeks were definitely like really tough. But I didn't have any issues going to Berkeley. Like I remember talking to friends who went like reasonably far, and they were like kind of freaking out even 6 months in. And I was totally fine. I wanted to go that far. My parents just told me I had to stay in the continental United States, and I took them at their word. That was my only restriction, was staying on the continent. I would have gone further if they had let me. I think I just knew that I wanted to do something different. And I think knowing that, even in those moments when it's scary, it grounds you. Those first 3 weeks at Berkeley were scary, right? I'm 3,500 miles away from my family, and I've never done that before. Like
Flying solo.
I had nobody, no family, nothing. It was just me in a public school where there's like everybody has friends from high school. It was a big deal, but I knew I wanted to be there, and I just made it through. And that's all you need.
You knew how to build that community from people who you didn't know before.
Exactly. One of my friends from freshman year was at my wedding. You make these friendships and they stay there. But I think that confidence, again, like I had it in high school because I knew that that was something I wanted to do and I was prepared for it. But you have to do it. What if I hadn't gotten into Berkeley? Would I have built that same muscle? A lot of it is just chance, I think, too. Like getting lucky and being able to take those chances and then feeling the confidence to do it. But I do remember a funny story. Like I was on the plane with my dad getting ready, and we got stuck on the tarmac. And my dad had said something to me about how he was so proud that I was so confident. And he fell asleep while we were waiting like the 3 hours on the tarmac. And in those 3 hours, I was like freaking out. so, even with all that confidence, you have these moments of doubt, right?
Well, and then there was no like cell phones for you to go, oh my God, Dad, like help me. Just like cut off.
Nope. Totally.
It's funny. And I was thinking this is a little bit off the beaten path as far as the questions are concerned, but I think thinking about now in your position at JP Morgan, you are a female vice president overseeing, however many people you're overseeing. That's a pretty big deal because, it's kind of like trying to crashed through the glass ceiling. Do you think it was harder for you to get to where you are now than maybe some of your male counterparts?
So it's interesting because I got started in advertising
Mm-hmm.
as an account director,
Mm-hmm.
and surprisingly, lots of women in that. I was always surrounded by at least like one or two female leaders. Probably throughout my career, I always had at least one female boss.
Mm-hmm.
So I think from that perspective, it never felt uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some places where it actually felt weird to see a male, you know?
Yeah.
What was interesting is because I was surrounded by so many strong women. And so not all of them were phenomenal bosses, but you see strong women all the time when you work in that field.
Mm-hmm.
At least in my side of the business, there are certainly sides of advertising that are still very male dominated, but my side, probably not as much. And so when I shifted into startups and I was working as the head of marketing at a fintech company, I think, other than in talent, I was the only woman in senior leadership at the time.
Right.
And that was not an issue. Like nobody had any issues with that. What was interesting was I remember getting my first review and I reported directly into the COO, and he was reading me my review, and he said, you got a lot of comments about how you could be a little less brusque, you could be a little bit less loud, like less mean, blah, blah, blah. And honestly, like the one wonderful thing about what he said after that was he was like, I want you to know that I don't care about any of this feedback. Do what you're doing. You're doing great. But I thought you should know it was there. That to me is, are you kidding? This is financial services. Half of these people came from like Goldman or Citi. Like there's no way they weren't like screaming at each other, you know? So the fact that that made it into my review felt very gendered. But then again, the fact that I had a manager at the time who was like, I don't actually care,
Mm-hmm.
was, I think, shows the progress that we've made a little bit. Like you can still be surrounded by people who don't see that, or at least don't see it as a problem. Like maybe I was brusque and maybe I was a little pushy, but he saw that as a value,
As an asset
to a detriment, right? So there's certainly some of that that's still there.
Mm.
And the one thing I'll say about, I think this is true for a lot of big companies, and it's not just JP Morgan, although it's true at JP Morgan as well. They're really trying to build out more understanding throughout the company of like the value of diversity. And that's everything from gender to sexuality to race to ability. And so I do think, and I've just seen it in talking to a lot of friends who work at some of the biggest companies in the world, and now working at one, it doesn't feel as divisive as it once did.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are still people who get what I got, right? And that's tough. I remember hearing that and being like, well, thank you for saying that you don't care, but like, oh my God, that's ridiculous.
This is a thing. This is still a thing.
Still a thing?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah. I know that diversity and inclusion has become a big buzzword, in the corporate area now. And now they have diversity and inclusion like departments and all that sort of like next to HR. So, I mean, that's great, but it's, we're in 2023, 2022 still, and it has to be a thing. Like,
and it still has to be a thing.
Yeah.
Totally. And that's sad, but at least people are moving until it's normalized. It's good that it's a thing.
Yes.
Right? Because otherwise it wouldn't be anywhere. We're not quite where we need to be, to your point, but I think we've certainly made progress. And I think
the needle's moving now.
Right. And I can just imagine that if I'd had that conversation with my COO like 20 years ago, it would have gone very differently. I'm grateful that you're starting to find allies who see that, and they see the like BS that it is, right? And that's nice. It feels refreshing.
Yeah. I'm really glad that we sort of did that little tangent, because I think it's important for young people, I'd say, teenagers who have no idea, where they want to go in the workforce yet. And even I feel like this platform is also very useful for like early 20 somethings who are, going through their sort of like late adolescence, and they're going into college or just graduating college. They're in their quarter life crisis. I think it's good for them to hear from somebody who's, been there, done that now for about 20 years, that things are looking up for the gamut of people, and women especially, and people of color and of different sexuality or different genders. I'm glad that you decided to share that. If you could look back and take, everything that you know today and talk to your young Dara self, what would your adult self tell young Dara to help ease the way?
Young Dara wouldn't listen to old Dara. I can tell you that. I think ultimately the message there is like it all feels very big. Every single thing feels very big. Mm-hmm. So much of it is so small. And even the big decisions, right? If you talk about something like college, like that feels really big. In the end, you can find your people almost anywhere. Like you can find yourself in a lot of different places. There's not one solution to every single problem. That's a life lesson that you learn over time. But that's the one thing I would say. Everything felt so big, and it was hard to manage all of that. The self-regulation was really difficult. Like I feel like I lost time on worrying about what I looked like and how I was doing in school and the future and boys and all that stuff. And it's like, it can be smaller if you allow it the space to be smaller. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean anything. Some of that stuff should mean something, but it doesn't have to take up as much space in your life as you let it. That's like the biggest lesson, right? It's like you can choose how much drama you want to give something,
how much brain space
it's
going to take up.
To a certain degree, it's a choice, right? Now I know like teenage brains are different and some of it may not be a choice, and there's some of that dysregulation that's like built into the psychology of being a teenager. And that's why I think like 17-year-old Dara just would have been like whatever, but but I think that's the biggest thing. Chill out. I used to have a saying. I had one of my best friends had given me a button that said "Don't panic," and that had become my motto. And I think I didn't really live it as much as I probably should have. And I would have said like, look at that button more frequently.
Push the button, push the button, push the button,
push the button. Totally, totally.
Yeah. One of the things I try and bring into it, and I've learned actually a lot from doing these conversations, that I think kids need to hear from the adults around them who they respect and who they love and who work with them. The mindfulness piece, like just let's all that stuff that's out there that right now that doesn't matter. Let's be right here so you can like put all of your brain energy into this thing. And then like when you walk out, you want to worry about that stuff, that's fine. And that like exercise in doing that every single day, I think just helps to pull it down a little bit. So I try and get that message across to them as often as I possibly can.
Totally. One thing that I picked up a few years ago, I became like I'll call it like a certified mindful business leader or whatever it's called.
Nice.
And one of the things that I learned is that different people find mindfulness in different places. And so some people actually need to meditate. And then there are some people who find it in other places. They knit, they play chess, they go for a run, and that's their way of managing their dysregulation. When I think back to being in theater and specifically being in dance, I think there's an element of that until dance became not fun for me anymore, which is what happens when you do something for so long. Sometimes it just loses its appeal. Until that happened, dance was my space. That was where I went when I was feeling like, I remember like dancing around the house. And a lot of that was because it was how I managed myself. Sometimes you have to find another way to do it.
I agree with you. And in fact, I think that everybody should have a bucket of those kinds of things so that you don't put all of your energy into that one thing. So that stays special to you. And so if like, you're not feeling that right now, there's like 4 or 5 other things or 10 other things that you could choose from to get your brain out of itself and into a task, into a project.
Yeah.
Well, what is something that your grappling with now as an adult?
Oh my God, being a mom, just a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. That's a big one. Being a working mom is being a working parent, I should say. It's not just moms. Being a working parent is tough because and this is true for stay-at-home parents too. I think at the end of because there's a lot of work there. At the end of the day, there are just moments where like I just don't have it in me to be the person that's going to help you through your toddler brain. And there are days when I'm very good at it and days when I'm just like, girls, like, leave me alone, you know?
Yeah,
And
honey,
I
can you
think,
please?
yeah. And that's the hardest part because I think it's the one thing I've learned from talking to parents of kids of all ages is that it just looks different as they get older. But I think the hardest part with little kids is that they don't yet know how to do anything on their own. So there's not even a moment where I get like a sulky teenager in a bedroom and I maybe get a half an hour break. You know, it's just all us all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's the hardest thing is how to manage myself so that I can be present for them. And when I know I can't be present for them, what does that mean? And what do I need in those moments so that like there's not a lot of yelling.
You don't mess up. You don't mess up.
But that's the hardest part is when you're working, whether that's working at a job or working with your kids all day, sometimes you just don't have it in you. 5 o'clock comes and you're just like done, you know?
You graduated before I had my kids.
Yep.
But I remember dropping them off at the daycare at like 6:30 in the morning and getting to work and starting my day at 7:30 and having the full teaching day and then rehearsals and like 4 o'clock, then running back to try and, get them and spend whatever time as a mom I could with that. And my husband didn't come home until like 7 o'clock. And it was exhausting.
It's exhausting. And then there are just so many wonderful moments within there too. And you want to be able to enjoy them for all they're worth, you know? And so that's another challenge. It's like, how do you stay present when you don't always have it in you to be present? It's a big thing, right? And when my oldest was born, I was working in a job that I liked. It wasn't necessarily something that I felt like a giant passionate pull towards. So it made it very easy for me to turn it off when I got home, which was great. And I'm lucky that I have a job now that's not that, right? Like I love my job. I think it's awesome. I'm very passionate about it. I feel it. What that means is I take it home with me, right? And so that's harder to manage and harder to figure out. How do you do that? How can you do both? And like I sometimes have to take late calls or early calls, and I sometimes have to work on a weekend. And I've been traveling for work this year with little kids. That's different, like you're trying to find time with the time difference and the events and the work and everything. And it's like, it's like, are they at school when I can FaceTime them?
Personality, it really is.
It's a lot. So I think that's the biggest challenge is like, how do you do it all? And I think you can't really do it all is the message. That's so much easier said than done.
I did my best to spend as much time as I could, but my job is my passion. Like my job is my passion. And so I never wanted to give it up. I never wanted to leave, to be a stay-home mom. I took my maternity leave and all that, but then I always came back and it was like, hit the ground running. I can't imagine being at the level where you are, where there is traveling. I mean, I was like 12 minutes from home, it was the commute was easy. You're taking flights here and going overseas. And I can't even fathom how much more complicated it must get to do all of that and still feel centered.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I think thankfully I'm not really commuting anymore. That's one benefits of COVID that came out for us is, the work from home, which is really nice.
Are you still doing that?
Yeah, predominantly. When we first moved, when we had we moved and I had a 1-year-old and I was like 7 months pregnant. and I had a 3-hour commute. So it was an hour and a half each way. And my husband's commute was almost 2 hours each way. You can imagine how burdensome that was. And we did it. We knew what we were doing when we bought this house, but it's a lot, and it takes a toll. And I'm so glad I don't have to do it anymore.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But I always said like the goal was either full-time work from home or find a job that's within like a 20-minute radius.
Yeah.
Which is hard in the suburbs. If I was still living in Manhattan, that would be so much easier. So
Well, you want it all, and at least you have more because you can do all of this working from home.
yeah.
God.
And look, I could have done it working from home 3 years ago. It just wasn't the norm, right? To be fair, it's not like my job changed.
Now it's kind of expected.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, tell me something that you miss about high school Dara. And then on the flip side, tell me one thing that's gotten better since you become an adult.
I think high school Dara had a lot of creative energy, and that lasted for several years, like even through college. And I think there was an element of, I think I always had that, right? Like I remember being at Coupe for like the summer programs, and like I won the choreography competition a couple of years in a row. And like, I think I always had that, right? Like that creative energy was always there, but it was such a focus. When I wasn't doing school stuff, I was creating something, writing, dancing, singing, something. And I'm definitely not an artist, but I dabbled in that too, right? So there was always some element of that. And I think I lost some of that along the way. Like I always found an outlet, but it wasn't always that. I've tried to get back into it here and there, and it hasn't always really stuck. And I think there's some element of that I would love to get back. Like where does that creative energy come from, and how do I build it into my like everyday? Maybe part of it is I sort of work in a creative industry and I'm doing it more than I realize on a regular basis, but it's not the same thing.
It's not that personal creativity that
Yeah.
you're doing it for yourself. But I think that once your kids get older and they're a little more independent, and when they are locking themselves in their room and all that,
Totally.
I think you could probably like sort of dabble in some of those things again.
Totally.
And so what's one thing that has gotten a little better?
I think just like my day to day is better. Like honestly, like I just walk through my day and it just feels very normal. There was no normalcy in high school for me. Everything every day felt like a challenge. And that's not to say that there was some like massive depression, but I just remember feeling like an overwhelming sense of like just emotion. I just don't have that anymore, right? Like I feel very settled. And that was true even before I met my husband. That was true before I had my kids. I think there's just an element of like, I'm just comfortable. I'm comfortable with who I am. I'm comfortable with where I am. And I think that is just such a nice way to go about life. I think just it's an overall feeling of how you live.
Well, it's how you approach, like when you're not settled, you approach the world in one way. When you are settled, it's a completely different experience.
Totally.
And yeah. So the adolescent chaos is like it makes you sweat the small stuff. It makes the small things so much bigger than they actually are. And when everything is toned down, you're like, what am I worried about?
Yeah.
All good.
At the same time, some of that angst probably led me to all that creativity. So there's probably some of that was feeding off each other, but
you're probably not wrong. Probably not wrong about that. Well, if you could give a piece of sage advice to high school students now who might actually listen, what would that be?
You'll get through it. We all got through it. You're going to have bad times. You're going to have big emotions. You're going to go through things that feel big and bad. And some of it feels really good and maybe overpoweringly so. And I think it's like, you're going to make it through it. We all do. And it might look different. And that's okay. The other thing I think I would say is don't worry about everybody else. I think that's one of the hardest lessons to learn. Who cares what somebody else looks like? Who cares what somebody else is wearing? Who cares how well somebody else did on their test? You worry about you. If you worry about you, you're going to do fine. Everything else is just noise. it's very hard, right? Because you're surrounded by these people all day and everybody wants to talk about where they got their clothes or what they got on a test or whatever. But like, it just doesn't matter. And it's not to say that you don't care about other people, you should, but in the way that it becomes like a competition, the second you feel competitive with somebody for no reason, that's a problem.
What do you think matters now?
I think it's staying grounded in what you want. Again, like I was an overachiever anyway. And then I come from a family of overachievers who pushed us. All very positive. It wasn't like bad, like dance mom pushing, but they pushed us. And so I just remember being, and I don't know if Mr. Pollard will remember this, but I remember being in junior high and my mom really wanted me to be an AP bio. And I was smart enough to be an AP bio. I didn't want to do AP bio. I have this firm memory of thinking to myself, I hate science. Why would I do this to myself? Like, why would I put myself through that hell? And I remember sitting in Mr. Pollard's office. I think it was probably like one of the first years he was there. Mm-hmm. And my mom is like pushing him to put me in the class. And he just looked at me and he was like, do you want to be an AP bio? And I was like, no. And he was like, well, I don't know what to tell you. Like, she doesn't want to be an AP bio, so I'm not going to put her in AP bio. Like, I think it's knowing who you are. I knew that, right? Like what I said before, like I knew enough about myself to know that, right? And I was not afraid to fight for myself, because I think there are some kids who end up, they're like, oh my God, my mom wants me to be an AP bio. I have to be an AP bio. And my answer was, I'll take every other AP on the list. I'm happy to do that. That is one that's never going to cross my path. And if you know who you are, then the rest of it is fairly easy. And that's a hard ask when you're young.
Yeah.
Sometimes you know these little things. You may not know the big picture, but you know these little things. You know that you prefer band over chorus. You know that you prefer science over math. Like you're going to know these little things. You know you prefer one group of friends to another. You're going to know these little things about yourself. Like own that.
That's the small stuff that's important.
That's the small stuff that's important, and it builds, right? And look at me. Did I need AP? I'm not like some crazy like zoologist or something. Like, did I need AP bio? No, I work in marketing. You know, it's like, who cares? So like ultimately you figure it out, right? There's no direct path. It feels very direct. It feels like you have to follow certain steps to do certain things. There's no direct path. And sometimes you have to fight for it because you don't follow that path, right? Like I went into advertising. Big advertising agencies recruit almost exclusively from schools with an advertising program or Ivies. I did not go to a school with an advertising program. I did not go to an Ivy. Right. It is very hard to get into the big agencies, having gone to like Berkeley as a history major. Honestly, there were a lot of people who were like, what is she doing? But you know what? I made my path and I got there, and I was laser focused. I had opportunities to work at other places, good brands doing other things. And I was like, nope, I want to work in an ad agency and I will not stop until I get there. Right. And I took a circuitous route, but I ended up there. You know what? I got there and I was like, I don't want to work here anymore. Yeah. And so you figure it out. I have friends who took those linear paths. There's nothing wrong with that. But if that's not what you want to do, you can still do it. It's okay. You will get there. As long as you're willing to put in the work, you're going to get there. But you have to stay true to what you know. I knew myself at that time, when I think back to that story with Mr. Pollard, like I knew myself well enough at that time to know that if I was focused on a really hard science class that I hated, I wouldn't have been able to focus on a history class that I love, because the history class came easy to me, right, but I wouldn't have been able to spend as much time on it. And that's not fair to me. Like, why would I want to do that to myself? I was still in like honors bio. It's not like I was in some terrible class. Right. There's an element there of who are you and who are these little things about you that you can start to identify. Yeah. And you know some of that earlier than you realize. You know some of that when you're like 10, you know? And how do you build upon that as opposed to getting stuck in somebody else's idea or getting stuck in the competition? I think that's the hardest part.
Yeah, it's using your personal resources wisely. We have just so much energy in our existence. Mm-hmm. And adolescents have a lot of energy typically, unless they're sleeping, but they do. Like when they're passionate about something, there's boundless energy. they'll wake up to do the things that they really love to do. And if you force them into a situation that they're miserable in, well, yeah, then everything else is going to suffer in their lives.
And I think sometimes you force yourself into those situations, right? Like you see your friends doing something, you think you have to do it. Like somebody tells you something about something and you're like, oh my God, and it sticks in your brain. Look, that happens even as an adult. I think the difference is as an adult, you start to learn how to sift through it a little bit better, right? You can sift through that noise a little better. Doesn't mean you don't get caught up in it sometimes. It's just easier to not get caught up in it. I think that's the hardest part, is that you don't always know how to identify what these things are that make up who you are. And I don't think you really realize that some of those little things, like what classes do I like? What activities do I like? Where do I want to spend my time? That's a big thing. That's who you are. And look, in 2 years, you might hate all that stuff. Like I hated science in high school. Now I love science, So you're going to change, and that's okay. You know more about yourself than you realize. And if you listen to that, that will help you ignore some of the noise that's around you.
True. Bringing you back to today, working parent, executive. What are 3 self-care practices that you do to help center or regulate yourself now?
Yeah, it's funny because one of them is something I practice with my oldest, which is taking a deep breath, right? It's actually fairly hard to find 3 seconds to take a deep breath sometimes. And sometimes I have to pull myself literally into the bathroom, which is sometimes the only place I can get some privacy. Not always, but sometimes.
Not always.
Not always. And just breathe. I never realized how much I needed my breath more than I do as a parent to 2 little kids. I think that's the first thing. Mm-hmm. The second thing is, and I found this sort of by accident, feeding babies in the middle of the night, I became very attached to my phone. And in some cases that's really bad. But the thing that I sort of picked up over time was it doesn't always have to be bad. Like I can download the Kindle app and just read on my phone. And so, because I always just read on my Kindle, because, it's not always great for your eyes to read on the phone. But what I realized was, sometimes that's all I have is my phone. And if that's where I can take a few minutes and read, and there are literally times when my kids are like playing in the playroom or something, and I'm just like on my Kindle app on my phone, just reading a book. But it centers me. It's like it takes my brain out of what I'm doing and it allows me to think about something else. And it's specifically novels. There's some like nonfiction that's helped too, but it's specifically novels. Like I think I need the escape of like, this is something totally different. It's not real. Because reality, I don't need, I live in reality. Like I don't need that every day. I think that's a big one. And then I think the biggest thing for me is knowing when to ask for help. Which is not always a very easy thing for me. I have a really, really hard time asking for help. And I always have had. Even something as simple as, and this happens every once in a while, we're just like on a Saturday morning, I just don't have it in me. I'm tired. And I'll just look at my husband and say like, I need an hour. Sometimes that hour is me napping. Sometimes that hour is just me like blissfully in my bedroom by myself. Even if I'm just looking at Facebook, it just feels like, but it's me time. Anything that could be me time. Sometimes I go for a walk. It really depends on my mood and what I really feel like I need in that moment. But it's the asking for help, which is the point. That's a very important moment for me the second those words come out of my mouth. It's not natural for me to do that. Right. I always feel like I can do everything. And
I got it.
Yeah. And that's totally not, it's like not reasonable. It's not a reasonable pressure to put on yourself. But yeah, that's a big one for me.
Yeah. The challenges of having the career. I remember, like the talk in the 80s when I was, a teenager, right, growing up, and the working woman and the moms trying to break through the glass ceiling, blah, blah, blah. And, we're still dealing with that. We're still talking about it. I think that the landscape has shifted, and changed, but it's still a lot to balance. And we expect so much of ourselves. And I think we think everybody else expects so much of us. That we have to live up to that expectation. And when you can manage that and keep yourself regulated and know when to say, it's time to step away for a moment. That's good for our kids. It's good for us. It's good for our relationships. And I think you're doing great.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It doesn't feel that way, but I appreciate it.
Oh, no. I remember going, me escaping it? Does that mean I'm like neglecting my children? Like,
totally.
if I close the door when I go to the bathroom, am I neglecting my child? It's okay. Well, thank you so much, Dara. I keep thinking in my head Dara Orlando, but it's Dara Handelman.
It's okay. It's okay. I changed my middle name, so Dara Orlando is still valid.
Really?
Yep, I am Dara Orlando Handelman. Yep.
Oh, that's perfect, because that's going to be the title of this. Thank you so much for taking the time out from your children and your busy life to sit and talk to your old theater teacher.
Well, I always loved you, and it's such a special place, and I like adore that I've somehow become part of this like crazy little family, and I love talking to the kids in school, and oh, it's just great. So
I can't wait to, like, once this gets out, I can't wait to share it with all the kids, because this sort of stuff of legends. I'm like, remember the troll kid? That's her.
Yeah, I think some of the pictures I sent you, I have the troll. So
it's like a little Easter egg in there.
My little troll. I know. She was so special to me for so long.
We still got her. It's all good.
I know you do.
So everybody tune in next week for episode 33 of Change for the Better, the Power of Arts in Education. Thank you so much.